This meeting is being recorded. Got it. Okay.
Okay, welcome to this roundtable on methodological approaches to peace. Welcome to the audience on Zoom, as well as the audience here in the room in Uppsala. My name is Elisabeth, Olivius, and I'll be sharing this roundtable. We have 4 eminent speakers. We have Lisa Strömbom, Madhav Joshi, Annick Wibben, and Pamina Firchow. And the speakers will have 10 minutes each for their opening remarks, and then we will have plenty of time for questions from the audience as well. So those of you listening in from Zoom, please do use the chat to write questions at any time. And you can also use the raise hand function to ask questions later. All right, and with that, I will give the floor to Lisa, our first speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be on this roundtable where I want to take the opportunity to talk about digital methods in peace research, and more specifically social media analyses in peace research. Will it be possible to get it up there or no?
Okay, so in the share screen.
Okay.
Yes. There we go. They can see it on Zoom.
They can see it on Zoom, but not in the room. Okay. So those of you who are on Zoom will also see a picture of my colleague, Isabel Bramsen. We work together on this project, so I want to also acknowledge her work in this. So instead of talking about kind of digital methods and social media analysis in peace research in the abstract, I want to try to do it through a project that we're working on as we speak. And what we do, and for those of you who do know what I do, it will not be surprising that we're actually looking at and analyzing online dynamics of agonism and antagonism. We look at Facebook interactions following a peace agreement as one way to capture public sentiments toward peace, or the way the public understands and discusses peace online. And what we do is to study more precisely agonistic interactions online. So it's frozen. All right. Yeah, I need my, I won't be able to do this 10 minutes without even seeing my own slides. So. Kommer ens förbi där, det här är konstigt städ. Oh, look at that. So what we do in our broader project is that we look at peace agreement and to what extent they've been followed by agonistic or antagonistic interactions in different social societal segments in Colombia, Israel, Palestine, and Northern Ireland. And this specific sub-project zooms in on interactions in social media and views on peace in Colombia from the time of the peace agreement, actually starting before the peace agreement and 5 years after that. And what we do then is that we know that in violent conflicts and also following violent conflict, we will have a lot of antagonistic interactions where people delegitimize each other, where they view each other as enemies, where they don't interact, and when they do interact, this with very destructive interactions. And we're really interested in the extent to which, after a peace agreement, there will actually be a change in relations from antagonistic to agonistic relations, where you can actually talk about the peace process without demonizing each other. So this is what we have tried to do online in this project. And the empirical strategy has been to collect Facebook pages. And what we've done is that we've selected about 600 pages in Colombia of individual politicians, of different peace organizations, grassroots organizations, various elite initiatives, etc., which all deal with peace in one way or another. Then we used keywords to kind of search these 600 pages. You can only imagine the amount of posts and comments on them. So we had peace keywords, which relates to the peace process in different ways, things like FARC, the state, the peace agreement, Santos, a lot of things in order to kind of get out those comments that actually has to do with peace. We started to gather the material, or we've selected a material starting in January 2016 to January 2021. So it's a 5-year, data collection. And what we do then is that we try to look at dynamics online of agonistic and antagonistic discussions on the peace process. And what we intend to do with this, now we're just about ready with the kind of data processing, so we're not there yet in terms of results, but what we want to see is both temporal fluctuations over time. So can we see certain periods where there is more antagonism or more agonism, or are there certain turning points which seem to be important when the dynamic shifts? Also, we can see geographical differences. So are there certain, because some of the pages are very geographically inclined around Bogota, for example, or in other locations which have been differently affected by conflict. So we can also see if there are different ways of talking about the conflict in different localities. And one thing I think that is really important that speaks to the broader social media research is to see, so how do those social media communities work? Are they echo chambers where people of the same inclination and view talk to each other? Or are they actually allowing for some sort of interaction across groups, across sentiments towards the peace process? Now I have a really, really nice diagram to show you that you will have to imagine. The people in the room, you who are with us on Zoom, will be able to see it, because we had to build this operationalization scheme with the help of our Danish computer scientist colleagues at Analyse and Tel, which is a computer scientist collective in Copenhagen. They worked a lot with Facebook analyses on Danish social media, of hate speech, of recognition in terms of trying to find xenophobia, anti-immigration views, etc. So with the help of their technical skills and our skills of how to analyze agonism, we've built those algorithms that can actually help us detect agonism and antagonism on social media. So the first step in the algorithm is to try to detect if there is disagreement. If there is no disagreement, then it's not relevant for us. But if there is disagreement and also enmity, demonization, for example, or delegitimation, then we would say, okay, so this is antagonism. But if there is disagreement, but no enmity, then there might be a chance that it's actually agonism. So then we go on and ask a couple of more questions in turn in order to determine that. So is there respect? Is there acknowledgement of the other's views, etc., in order to detect that? So when we look at antagonism, then we look for in these comments which contain enmity, misrecognition, delegitimation, or hostile, violent attitudes. As I can't show you examples, I will read them instead. If we look at antagonism as demonization, for example, then there is someone saying this is a fascist government, they are rapists. Or as delegitimization, so Roy continues to defend those narco-terrorists, friends of his. So those are what we would characterize as antagonistic concepts or understandings. When we then move to agonism, we define it as, again, disagreement, but no enmity, and then either recognition of identity of some sort, acknowledgement of opinion, or openness to dialogue or difference. So some examples here, these are of course translated from Spanish is that someone says peace is built with our enemies. Someone else says, according to you, because they're my friends, they're my arguments, and that's worthy of respect. Your comments are also worthy of respect, but if we're going to insult each other, I'm out. So it's different variations where people actually say that, we can speak, we might not agree, but we can still speak to each other. And I think what's important here, this is of course one project. We also have a couple of other sub-projects where we look at recognition, for example, on Facebook, following certain decisive events such as the Abraham Accords between Israel and some Gulf states, and also after Trump's recognition move in 2018 when he decided to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So those are very different projects, but I think it's really interesting to think about what social media can tell us as peace researchers, because I do think that, for example, as people have been talking about here today, we can have research fatigue in conflict contexts. If we have surveys, we can, of course, by asking bad questions, getting really bad results. So I think social media should be one way to approach conflicts. Of course, they can't tell us everything, but what we've seen here is that when we've built those algorithms, we had Spanish-speaking coders who taught the algorithm Spanish, because there were no algorithms in Spanish for agonism or antagonism before. So they worked very intensely for about a month to code individual comments, which were then translated into NLP scripts that would kind of run through these, I think, more than 12,000 Facebook comments. So it's big data, and with all the kind of problems that come with that in terms of validity and reliability. But I still think that what you can get from it is still an idea of maybe not what people in general think about peace, because this is, of course, a special segment. People who are on Facebook, not everyone is on Facebook. And also we know from other research that social media tends to polarize the people who are actually on there. So people tend to be a bit more, I think, antagonist there because you don't see people. So you can kind of maybe fuel some of your anger more there than you would do face to face. But I still think it's really interesting, and something that has come out now that even though we're not done is that we have, of the 12,000 comments that we went through, a little less than 90% seem to be antagonistic, and that says something. So then it's really interesting. So this minority of agonistic comments, where do they take place? Do they take place in certain forums? Is it at certain times? And we're not there yet. But I think it's a really interesting way if you want to talk about broader public sentiments about peace. I think this is one part of the puzzle that we can use. So I want to throw that in there. As much as I've had doubts about this, I certainly do still to a certain extent. I also think that we have to take this opportunity that social media gives us, because it's not only a matter of, so what do we know about peace from social media, but a lot of people today living, either living here and reading about Ukraine or Colombia or whatever, or the people living in the conflicts, a lot of the information that they get is actually through social media. So whatever it represents, it's something that really circulates knowledge about conflicts. So I think we have to take it seriously and really engage in a discussion on the promises as well as pitfalls of these types of analyses. So I think I'll end there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next speaker is Pamina Firchow. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. So we were given a set of questions, and when I looked at those questions, which were all around measuring peace, I thought I'd add some more questions and thought that in order to answer those questions, we really need to step back and reflect on primarily two fundamental questions. Why do we need to measure peace? What's the purpose? What's the goal? And perhaps more importantly, for whom do we measure peace? So answering why we need to measure peace allows us to understand what's necessary to include when we think about the measurement of peace, right? So are we measuring peace for for what goals are we measuring peace? Is the goal agenda setting? So are we trying to ensure that countries are all on the same page, that we're all meeting similar milestones or targets, or is it to name and shame? Is it to indicate that one state is perhaps more is moving forward more on a milestone or target than another? Or is it to provide information and engage theory? And I think the providing information and engaging theory goal is the one that we usually think about when we think about measurement. But the agenda setting and naming and shaming is often what we see in the policy world. And each of these goals requires different kinds of methodological decisions to be made. And peace really can't be measured in one way. We need to take into consideration these goals in order to understand how best to measure peace. I think also when we think about why we need to measure peace, we also, and when we're measuring peace, need to state clearly the goals and the goals of the measurement mechanism when we make claims. And that's something that's often not done, right? Because peace is so broad, it's very, very relative, right? The goal is very much related to the outcome. And oftentimes we're not talking about why we're measuring when we make claims using our measurement mechanisms. And I think also, I mean, you know, when we think about measurement, we think about quantitative approaches. But since peace is nonlinear, our collective efforts of looking at progress can help contribute to a better understanding of change. So we should really think about exploring other ways of measurement. Qualitative and participatory ways of measurement, social media, for example, other approaches to thinking about how we and why or how different forms of measurements can address this question of what kind of mechanism we're choosing to use in order to measure peace in response to the needs and goals, right? I think another form of data that we don't talk about a lot in measurement is metadata. And we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about varieties of peace and talking about emotions. But I think this idea of using metadata in measurement is something that's rarely talked about. And Talia's comment earlier about whether or not metadata is maybe more subjective and how to think about using metadata in measurement in a way that we can ensure that we are interpreting it correctly, I think is an interesting question. I think that one of the challenges, however, is because of these methodological and epistemological divisions that we've been talking about today, we've really siloed ourselves off to think about how we can work together to measure progress. So we really need to think about how we can bring different epistemological and methodological approaches together to measure peace in different ways. So when we ask about for whom we're measuring peace, it allows us to think a lot about the intentional direction of our field, right? We were talking about the intentional, the normative direction of the field of peace, peace studies, peace research. And so we also need to consider the audience, and then also need to consider who we are saying something about. So who gets to decide what is meant by peace and how it's measured, and that then allows us to think about who steers the discussion. And I mean, we talked a bit about this already, but this contrast between and this question about what happens when local conceptualizations contrast with liberal conceptualizations, I think really plays out in measurement. So when, for example, or even external conceptualizations contrast with internal conceptualizations. So for example, if we think about like an indicator like police presence, right? Police presence can mean peace for some populations, but for others, as we've seen in the last couple of years, it certainly does not. And so we need to think as well about who we're including in those measurement processes. And I think that also leads us to think about this tension about between how peace is experienced and what is needed for peace, and then a demand to measure universally by policymakers and IR scholars. And I think that's something that in our work with everyday peace indicators that we've really seen as a real challenge. We've taken on that challenge, but peace is really experienced differently at a local level. And then, but how do you square that circle when you have a demand for broader and a need for broader measurement mechanisms? And in particular by policymakers needing to make decisions about larger territories, not being able to tailor necessarily their policies to particular specific communities and needs. But then also, you know, this question of comparison and a demand for comparison, and how can you, I guess, measure and continue to agenda set if that conflicts with local conceptualizations and you know, subnational conceptualizations of peace. So I think I'll stop there and let the others talk.
Thank you, Pamina. Next speaker is Madhav Joshi.
All right. I have really, fancy PowerPoint with a lot of transition. So you have to imagine that, or maybe you would be able to open that in your computer as I talk. So that way, it would be a lot easier for me to communicate what I am talking. But I still need to say
of course you
what
do.
I have here.
Rely on the tech.
Yeah, exactly. So, as you know, most of my research focuses on peace processes, peace building, how to implement peace accord once the parties sign comprehensive peace agreement. And one of the consistent findings in our research is, if the parties are able to implement peace at a higher rate, then probably that would lead to better socioeconomic political outcome, in the long term. But one of the persistent, questions that we get when we interact with policymakers is that, okay, you saw all these nice things, and what happens if the parties are able to implement at a higher rate? But tell us how to get to the CPA. What is the pathway to the CPA? So that is the question that we are grappling with in our research. So what I'm going to do here is just, as a field of study, so this is the graph that you see here since 1989, and I have a projection for up to 2014 here, 2024 here. So as a field, when I search Google Scholar, the term that I use is peace processes and peace building since 1989. up to this year, and then the projection for up to 2024, because I am doing it a 5-year chunk here. So in 1989 to 1994, there were only 57 scholarly outputs that has term peace processes and peace building. So between 2020 and 2024, that will be 12,000. So you can imagine the volumes of scholarly output that we are producing so it's exponentially a lot of research out there. But still, the point that I'm trying to make here is that as a field, we have expanded, in terms of the research. But a lot of progress has been made, but to understand the peace processes, armed conflict, what happens to peace building once the parties are able to resolve. But the thing, going on here is obviously, at the same time, we have a lot of data, that allows us to understand various issues related to peace processes, peace agreement, and so on. We can think of the Uppsala data on peace agreement, our own data on peace accords metrics, on implementation of peace agreement, even everyday peace indicator, trying to understand peace from different perspectives. And you can, throw in the peacekeeping data, the mediation data, and things like that. So a lot, in terms of research. But at the same time, I think, overall, if you ask me to synthesize the field, and I would still say that it is a theory-rich but data-poor field that we are tackling with. So we have a lot of theories on how to make peace, how to do peace building, but we really don't have, enough empirical data on how we really test those concepts, some of the concepts, some of the theories in our field. So briefly, what I am thinking here is tackle 2 specific questions that we have faced in our peace accords metrics work as a broader research program and in terms of our research in Colombia. So the first sets of questions that we encounter is specific to the pathways to peace, right? So what are the pathways to peace, to comprehensive peace accord? How do we know the parties build mutual trust? So that is one of the key questions that we often get. And does trust improve overall peace accord implementation? How do we know that? So that is one set of questions, that we encounter. And then another set of questions, that we encounter and related to practice, work, and we are trying to do that in terms of actual research here, is who implements peace, right? Who are the actors when the peace is implemented and where the peace is implemented? So these are the things, and I'm trying to unpack that in a way that is understandable here. So first pathways to peace is, specific to, the multiple ways, the parties can negotiate, CPAs, right? And you can think of example like, Lebanon's 1989 Taif Accord. One peace accord, everything stops. We even don't know for how long the parties actually negotiated. But we were told that, that there's one peace accord and that's it, right? So another pathways to peace is the parties were negotiating a lot of partial peace accords, and ultimately those partial peace accords do not build upon each other. So over time, they continued the negotiation process, and finally they get to the CPA. Is another pathway there. The another pathway is there. Then the parties negotiate a lot of partial peace accords, and some of the partial peace accords were reaffirmed as they negotiate on one, and they produce a lot of peace accords like that. And ultimately, some of the partials were reaffirmed in the final agreement that we call comprehensive peace accord, right? So that is another trajectory, another pathways to get to the comprehensive peace accord. And the interesting thing is another pathway is then the parties negotiate partial peace accords. The partial peace accords in its entirety is implemented, or parts of it is implemented, and then they get to another partial peace accord, and they get to another partial peace accord, and finally they get to the comprehensive peace accord, and they implement that comprehensive peace accord. And even after comprehensive peace accord, there are cases where they still have to renegotiate, right? And I mean, there are quite a lot of peace accords, comprehensive peace accords, where parties were able to renegotiate that. So the puzzle, I mean, there was really, it's a fancy graph, you have to check it.
Fancy.
You have to check it out, yeah. So
very impressive.
So in terms of in terms of the trust building, I focus on two specific things that happens in that pathways. I focus on the reaffirmation of the earlier peace accord that gives you whether the parties are building on earlier progress or not. That is one way to understand whether parties are trustworthy in the negotiation process or not. And then the another one is, whether the parties were actually implementing some of those things or not, so that they keep on the momentum to get to the CPA. So the empirical analysis that what we are doing here, we are expanding the number of CPA cases, and then we are actually going back to the specific CPA process to understand how many partial peace accords were negotiated in that sequence, and to what extent, given partial peace accord was implemented or not implemented, reaffirmed or not reaffirmed in the subsequent one. And we have a preliminary data that we use to test, whether those trust building, exercise that I define in terms of reaffirmation and implementation of some of the partial peace accords actually lead to better outcome in terms of the overall peace accord implementation down the road. And there is some positive correlation. So one of the ways to understand the trust building exercise in the negotiation process is actually look the parties, what they are doing, not too much focus on the external actors, because so far we have been relying on the external actors, mediators, to build trust between these actors, who have to resolve their disputes and then get back to normal, political process, right? So that is one set of research questions that we are grappling with. Another one is specific to, who implements peace. So we understand the peace accord implementation, so okay, the peace accord implementation is a success, right? But the thing, that we have to do here is a little bit tricky in a way that so there is a lot of things going on in terms of implementing a given provision in the peace accord, right? And it's quite a lot in terms of the various things that you have to put together for implementing something. So, but what is the way, the process, who implements where and what? To address that particular chunk of research questions, you actually have to unpack what is being implemented, so, and the way to do that is actually then in this, I have a trajectory to understand, and it is again a really fancy graph, I would like to suggest to check out. So it's like, what is happening in the short term all the way to the long term. And this is precisely the idea, coming from the Colombian implementation process. Colombian implementation process is not like, 1 year peacemaking exercise. It has at least 15 years of trajectory. You can expect, a lot of things happening in the next 10 years still, right? If you are really trying to understand what is going on in that particular space. So I call it the temporal aspect of it. There is a short-term aspect to it. There is a mid-term aspect to it, or long-term aspect to it, right? So there is a temporality of that one. And then another one is the geospatial aspect of it. You have the things that is implemented at the national level, that is implemented at the regional level, and that is something that is implemented at the local level. So there is a special aspect to that one. And you can think of there are various actors of different size and influence coming into the play here, right? So a lot happens there. And at the same time, during the implementation process, new actors come in and more actors get out. So there is a kind of back and forth, that dynamics there. And then, maybe in the short term and at the national level, the focus is on perhaps, this is inductive based on what we have found so far from the data that we have collected is, build the institution, work on ceasefire, do like a big national level implementation. Maybe that is at the national level, and then short-term priorities immediately after the signing of the peace accord. And then After that, in the long term, then how you translate the policies and programs and implement that for over time. Like, when I think about Colombia, it is the territorial, priorities, the eradication of illicit drugs, and then the substitutions, reintegration of the combatants. So these are the sometimes long-term priorities that we don't know. Who are the actors, who implements it, where it is implemented. So it is basically like trying to unpack all those things as the next phase of the peace process research. Overall, then the idea is then, this is the graph that I produced as part of the Afghan negotiation process, where we would be able to map out, who are the actors specific to how they relate to each other in terms of the network, and also in terms of issues, how those issues pull some actors together, but not others. So we would be able to examine all these things. So I think that is something that that is for next 5-10 years of the research program. And I stop here. Thank you for being patient.
Thank you so much, Madhav. So we're moving on to our last speaker, Annick Wibben.
Yes, thank you. So we were talking earlier about positioning oneself. I'm going to try to do that in a slightly different way than was talked about earlier. But I think it's important to sort of give a little bit of background as to where these thoughts are coming from, and because they're a little bit different, maybe not so much in this direction. But so several years ago, 2016, I want to say, some of us get together and had a series of workshops to basically create a feminist peace research network in response to a sort of actually Journal of Peace Research talking about 50 years of peace research and sort of mentioning Elise Boulding in a side note. And so we were like, wait a second, let's actually think about the feminist contributions to peace research and bring them back. I will tweet out a couple of things later that have come from that. But basically what we've been trying to do ever since is sort of bring those contributions back in a way and also build on those contributions in the past. And I should mention here, there is a handbook on feminist peace research co-edited by Tarja and some other people. So again, I'll tweet out some references later. But I think what's important here is that, the focus of these efforts, I think, is rather different maybe from some of the other work that we have heard about. And one of the things that a couple of us talked about in a collective discussion piece in International Political Sociology a couple of years ago was that we are quite interested into providing insights into not just what could be termed the sort of spectacular instances of violence, wars, et cetera, but also our analysis of the everydayness of peace and the possibilities of peaceful coexistence and conflict transformation in this everyday, right? Going beyond the war and peace dichotomy, paying attention to questions of social justice, for instance, interpersonal and intercorporal relations. And of course, as feminists, right, we are necessarily analyzing gender alongside sexuality, race, class, caste, religion, et cetera, as power structures, right? So power is really, really important. And the empirical settings, the various contexts are really, really important as well. So in that sense, we argued, feminist peace research complements the traditionally male stream and heteronormative accounts of peace and justice, which tend to miss these intersections for all their attention to other types of power relations. So I think that that's important sort of as a sort of grounding moment for where this comes from. Secondly, then, since we're supposed to talk about methodology, I have been working for quite a while with a narrative approach, drawing on the work of actually a Dutch narratologist, Mieke Bouw, specifically, but also more generally on feminist, post-structural, post-colonial, and other critical work. So this work is firmly located within the human sciences. or what we might call the interpretivist tradition, depending on how you slice the cake, which really is interested in exploring how life is made meaningful and how sort of those meanings actually shape how we live and how we maybe are peaceful or not. Well, that's and in that in this sort of tradition also, or for feminists more generally, maybe objectivity is all about situatedness, situated knowledge, and there's a deep suspicion of a view from nowhere, right, and the denial of responsibility that we think comes along with that view from nowhere. Then the other thing that came up a couple of times already is the question of the continuum of violence. This is a really important concept for feminist researchers, feminist peace researchers. This is the continuum which transgresses the boundaries between peace and war. And I do think it's not unequivocally clear that Ukraine is only at war. And I think we should talk about that in the Q&A. But it also transgresses the boundaries between the public and the private, between the international and the domestic. And here, for example, violence against women is a sort of phenomenon that we can think about in sort of a very multi-dimensional way. In the context of violence in the home, right? But it extends also to sort of say the structural violence of poverty that of course impacts that violence in the home, to the ecological violence associated with the depletion of our planetary resources and our natural disasters that come along with, for example, global warming, to, of course, also, right, the violence of war and its aftermath. But these are not disconnected in the way that they sometimes are seen to be in some of the literature. So this narrative approach then can help us, I would argue, capture some of this complexity that really, I think, feminist scholars are very interested in and sort of want to bring from the sort of everyday groundedness. And maybe there's the difference between the indicators of, and I just want to say a couple of things that for me are really important as part of this narrative approach. And it's not just about sort of pointing to the fact that, we all kind of make sense of our own lives and of events in the world by telling stories about them, right? These stories are really important also. There's sort of a linkage between identity formation and these stories that we tell and how we place ourselves. But also that in the way that I conceptualize it, it's really important that the differences among the storytellers and stories are explicitly acknowledged, rather than sort of smoothed over or seen as a hindrance to good science, right? Or to sort of good policy recommendations or something, but to actually point to that complexity. And they are interrogated for what they can tell us about the storyteller's conflicts, the multiple strategies that might be employed to address these conflicts, the strategies that come from those who tell the stories themselves, and the multiplicity of perspectives that exist in relation to them. So meaning that we can collect a variety of stories or narratives about a singular event, and we can therefore get a much better grasp of that particular event and the various positionalities in relation to that. So paying attention to the contextuality and the multiplicity, their shifting nature, their sort of temporal and spatial location, the way they are co-constitutive of identity, provides meanings to events and to life more generally, that I would argue helps us not only to contextualize the sort of particularity of an event and the sort of gendered, etc., power relations in it, but also fundamentally sort of challenges the idea that we can have a singular notion of peace. So very much varieties of peace, right? And that there's sort of a thing called peace that can be measured. I did bring the measure thing and the measure question in here for 1 second, right? Or that can be objectively measured. Rather, it is something that is both made and unmade all the time and in multiple ways, right? So Carolyn Nordstrom's work, I think, is really great on this. And she has a nice quote where she says, if violence seeks to crush the possible, people far from being passive victims recreate the possible as a tactic of survival and political agency. And I would argue they do so partly through the stories they tell and the ways in which they sort of remake meaning in that process. They transform, potentially, not always, they can also go the other way, potentially can transform sort of the meaning of the past, or, you know, sort of imagine an alternative future. And I think this is also important. We talked a little bit yesterday about peace as a utopia. And I think that here again, the possibility, and this is going back then to Elise Boulding as well, the possibility of imagining alternative futures is really, really important. Peace then becomes an activity, right? It's created and it's meaningful within a particular context. And the kind of narratives then, to wrap it up, that feminist scholars tend to focus on, those on the margins, I think we had this in the previous panel, they give us a very different account from those state-centric narratives, and also from the kind of traditional theory which aims to fix meanings and identities. Rather, we have a variety of meanings, and they also, I would argue, actually, you know, don't just tell us something about the margins, but they tell us something about the center in the way that they point out, sort of, they're always in some way in relation to that center as well. So the varieties of meanings of peace as experienced in the everyday, I would argue, can be captured in this sort of narrative approach. And finally, sort of as a side note, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, when we write in a narrative way, right? When we sort of keep that sort of, if we can manage to sort of write the complexity also into our accounts of these stories, and I think actually one of your collaborators, Jenny Hedström, has just written a nice piece on this. Then we are actually allowing sort of for a conversation that's going to continue, in the sense that the next person can actually come in and sort of question that narrative. So it's sort of also maybe a plea to sort of get away from needing to finish and fix whatever piece or some other thing is, and actually allow sort of the next interlocutor to say, okay, that's a nice story, but here's another element to it that you missed, and we can sort of take it from there and pick up the thread again and tell the next story. And that's, I'm still working on that one. I haven't quite figured out how to do that, but there's some really interesting work in the sort of narrative field, maybe to check out. That's that.
Thank you very much, Annick. Okay, so what we're going to do first now is that I'm going to let you briefly respond to each other's opening remarks, if there's anything you want to pick up on, before we open up for questions from the audience. So do write your questions in the chat for the people on Zoom, and think about your questions for the rest of you. I'll throw in one question right away for you that you can respond to if you want to elaborate a bit on that. And that's, how are the methodological approaches that you have been presenting, how are they linked to specific ways of understanding what peace is, and where and how we can observe peace? So basically ontology and epistemology. And what would you see as the main kind of differences, maybe between you, the panelists, or within our field when it comes to that?
Oh, that's a small question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can start just briefly, and I want to pick up on what you talked about, Pamina. Why do we measure peace? Because I think, I mean, I try to be, not in terms of what I do, but in terms of how I assess research, to be a pluralist in terms of thinking that certain research questions lend themselves better to certain methodologies than others. So if we have a methodology that's suitable with a question, then I don't mind if it's, you know, quant or qual or interpretative or whatever, as long as it's, you know, done in a good way. And I think, and I hope that we all kind of share that. And one thing that I was thinking about, because there's, of course, a lot of intricacies of how to measure peace. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about that today, negative, positive, negative in different variations, and also your beautiful diagrams that I got to see here that not everyone saw. So I mean, there are so many intricacies, and of course we need many different methods for that. But I think one thing why we also have to measure peace has to do with the legitimacy of peace, because we can have those, you know, very nice anchored peace processes on different levels, but then we also have people living in that society, and that can be measured in different ways. It can be measured, you know, very ethnographically and deep and very, I mean, resource demanding in terms of human power that goes into doing that. And then we can do more aggregate studies depending on how much time we have. I mean, everyday peace indicators is fantastic, but I can only imagine the kind of funding that takes. So, I mean, it's also a matter of what we can do in terms of time and so on. So I think I just want to end here and kind of this plea to pluralism, that we can kind of keep that. And I think this is nice also for this room, because we all do very, very different things. And I think that it makes our discipline richer, really. So we shouldn't, you know, stay in our trenches, but be appreciative of those different efforts.
Pamina, do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, just to address the other panelists, Madhav, you had said that you had asked, I guess you stated that you thought that that we don't have enough data, and that we need more data in order to adequately study peace. And I guess, you know, I'd be interested to hear more. And I mean, because in my experience, I feel that we have so much data and oftentimes don't know what to do with that data. And when we look at the data that's collected in the field by practitioners in the peace building space, oftentimes there's just enormous amounts of quality of quantities of data that are collected and filed away, right? And so I wonder, is it that we don't have access to the data, or that the data is maybe not in the format that we can use? Or is it really just that we don't have enough data? I thought I mean, you really presented a lot of very interesting thoughts about questions of power and objectivity. But in particular, I thought it was interesting how you talked about the continuum of violence that transgresses the boundaries between violence and war. And I thought in particular how that relates to to positivist ways within our field in particular, where we really try to nail down what we mean. I mean, we just saw, or heard a presentation, which was very interesting, but also very much tries to nail down what we mean by negative peace. And I thought, I'd be interested to hear more about how that relates and how we can infuse potentially, some feminist thought in the more concrete positivist frames of measurement.
Thank you. Madhav?
All right, so this is, very diverse perspective in terms of, concept and how we measure some of the concepts. And thank you for your intervention. The comments were really, really useful. The one thing that is really interesting is, we have not talked about it, but maybe, we are starting to talk about it, thinking about your own project and the paper that I published with colleagues from Notre Dame on social media, how that social media influenced the outcome of Colombian referendum. So maybe it is also time to talk about online violence and peace. So that's a good way to think about. It's not only about that's totally different world. And maybe in a couple of years, violence in metaverse. We don't know, right? So there's a lot that we can think of in terms of peace research. In terms of Pamina, your question, maybe there are a lot of data. I kind of agree and don't agree with that one. kind of agree is because obviously, there is a lot of data, but what if you don't have access to those data? So that's the key thing, right? And the quick example that came to my mind when you were talking was like, Jeff Bezos is billionaire, what is the purpose of those billions of dollars? Because people are still dying on the street, without access to food and resources, right? It really, and what I am trying to say here is that the acquisition of data is itself power politics. And we also, and it influences, a lot of research that we do, and specifically to our own research, like, to what extent Peace Accord is implemented, not implemented, what happened. We even struggle to find some of the hard copy of the Peace Accords that they were signed, still don't have access to those documents. You can think of like, the networks that I have, the networks that I have mobilized to get those PDFs, still not able to get those things. And if you move that to the actual Peace Accord implementation, even harder, right? Now you think of like, getting information from the territories on what happened in terms of the implementation, even harder. So getting access to data is power politics, and we have to be very careful of like, it is not like, and for me, if I cannot access that data, that does not exist. I have to create my own. That's the way I think of, in terms of data, so.
Yeah, sort of as the last person, I feel like I already have to respond. I mean, I think the question of like, methodology, obviously it has to be useful for the questions you're trying to ask. And I think some of us have maybe started, developing some because we had questions that there weren't any good methods for, at least that was definitely my thing, where I was like, okay, I'm trying to get at this question. Somehow none of the traditional stuff works. So, then you try to develop something, right? And then afterwards you're constantly defending it because, everybody's like, but why that and not that? But, that's fun. I guess you can build a career. But so yes, for sure. I mean, I'll read all kinds of other things, not saying that I'm completely up on the latest regression, sort of stuff, but, you can ask your colleagues if you need help or something. But I guess it's, in a way we are asking different kinds of questions. And, but I think, maybe trying out something else sometimes is kind of cool. Like you're learning new things about Facebook or, other people have done other things. So that's interesting. And in the sort of narrative field, I think there have been a lot of developments in the last, 10, 15 or so years, lots of people trying different kinds of things. I mean, are you constructing these narratives? Are you, are you analyzing interviews through these techniques? Are you, what are you looking at, like narrative as in, novels or other kinds of things? There's a fictional IR, really fun stuff. My students always get super like, this blows my mind. It's very fun to talk about because then you have the fiction truth distinction and all of this kind of stuff. But we are all writing fiction all the time, by the way. So something to think about, scenarios and all of these kind of things. So I think, yes, definitely pluralism for the win, so to speak, with the young ones. On the question of the continuum of violence and the sort of peace-war distinction or non-distinction, right? I mean, I think, again, it comes from the kind of questions that, some of us are trying to ask. So, for example, around, sort of, say, sex and gender-based violence during wartime sort of became a big thing, partly because of the UN Security Council resolutions, et cetera, et cetera. But, is it fundamentally different from the kind of violence that happens in the everyday, in the sort of home, in the domestic, et cetera? Does it shift in intensity? Does it matter what the intention is? For whom does it matter, right? So those kind of questions, I think, they sort of cross that that sort of supposed boundary between peace and war. There's also the question of like, okay, so if you're, supposedly in a peaceful country like, say, Sweden, and you're sort of in a war at home, war, with quotation marks maybe. Does that matter that the rest of it is supposedly peaceful? So I think there are these things, and then there's of course also the question of like, within war, there's a lot of peace moments, for example, right? So they're not, it's not all the time just horrific or something like that. So I think there's ways in which it sort of can, it draws our attention to different things. And can we, for example, in an ongoing war, also at the same time think about these things that need to happen with regard to, this moment of supposedly after war, which we also know is not really an after or the post. We had this earlier. The post is not really a post. So I think that this is, these are all kind of questions that are interesting. But I think the sort of question that, who are we really measuring it for, becomes kind of important in this context as well. So I'd love to talk more about that.
Thank you. So I will open up for questions. I'm going to take 2 questions from the room and 2 from Zoom initially, and then we'll let the panelists respond. So I have Tim on the list already, and then maybe 1 more from the room here in Uppsala. Please go ahead, Tim.
Thank you, Elisabeth, and thanks to the panel for a really stimulating set of questions on measurement. I have 2 questions, one for Professor Strömbom. And the first one for you, I wondered if in the project, if you measure or have considered measuring the effect of peace messaging, such as we saw after the agreement, the Havana Agreement in Colombia, the so-called Respira Paz effort to induce public education. It had a social media component, as I recall. I'm very interested in the effects of peace, measuring peace messaging. And then secondly, for Professor Joshi, very interesting on social trust and social networks. And I can confirm those are very nice social network maps that you have on your PowerPoint. How effective are the use of proxies for measuring social trust and social distance? Often this area where you get to the most sensitive kinds of things, such as intergroup trust, the use of proxies, is that something you would recommend? And how do you articulate the connection between the proxy and the real phenomenon you're seeking to measure? And then finally, hey, a comment, I was really interested in hoping to hear a little bit from the panel on the use of randomized control trials in conflict-affected environments. We saw some nice publication on this with regard to Iraq and the use of football for peace. And my understanding, it's also being carried out in Colombia and Lebanon at the moment on different types of peace-building interventions. So if an advanced student or other colleague comes to you with an RCT in a conflict-affected country or environment, recommendations, suggestions, or maybe suggestions for alternate methods as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to read 2 questions from Zoom. First, we have from Dylan Herrera. To everyone, when measuring peace, most works in the last 30 years measure program outcomes, for example, of people who got vocational training, but no evaluation asked about the impact for individuals, victims or perpetrators. For example, was that training useful for finding a job? How can we produce a shift from measuring activities to measuring the changes for people? And then we have 1 question from Elaine Prattley, also to everyone. Have the panelists seen the emphasis on using or interpreting words, or the meaning of words, as a means of knowledge building, as a limitation or challenge to understanding peace, in terms of how questions are framed and the search terms used? that research participants have shared understanding of what the researchers mean by peace, conflict, etc., key research terms. Is this issue compounded when working with people of different cultures and languages? All right, let's take a round of responses, and we can take more questions if we have time after. We can start with Pamina and work our way towards me, perhaps.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Maybe to start with the question from Tim on randomized control trials. I mean, we've certainly seen that randomized control trials have had an impact on the development field. And in peace building, perhaps their use is more limited, although, or maybe not their use, but their utility. Although, I mean, certainly, you know, if you're trying to isolate and explain a very small sliver, answer a question that's very specific, they can certainly be very useful, but oftentimes, in particular in such complex environments that we're functioning in, where we don't see, it's very difficult with a randomized control trial to see, to illustrate and highlight the things that, you know, that are not seen by such a controlled experiment. So if you're, I mean, I think quasi-experimental designs, I mean, if you're thinking about experiments, and if, for example, you're working with policymakers who are concerned about controls and want comparisons, quasi-experimental designs maybe offer a little bit more flexibility. They're not as concrete, right? And the causality is perhaps not as established. But still, it leads us to a little bit more certainty in terms of, you know, being able to do some comparison between treatment and controls. To answer the two questions online, and I mean, to think, yeah, I mean, this question of outcomes versus impact, and thinking about you know, evaluating programming in particular, this is always a challenge, and something that we see a lot in our work. It's a question that happens at the project level, but also at the program or country level, right? And so when we're talking about thinking about impact, we're not just thinking about the impact of a particular project, although that's important, but also what does you know, and this is oftentimes the question that policymakers make is, you know, what the entirety of our portfolio of programs, what impact are they having, and how are we progressing towards peace? But of course, this brings us back to the same question of standards and whose, you know, whose standards are we talking about? Impact on what? Impact on peace, but then according to whose standards? So, I mean, with everyday peace indicators, I think that's one of the reasons why EPI has resonated so much with policymakers in particular. There's I mean, you know, the enthusiasm is palpable. Perhaps more so with policymakers than academics even, although I feel you're all enthusiastic too, but because of this frustration with not being able to adequately think about impact. But I think I want to take this a step further and say that often there's also a very limited understanding of what of how to measure in the policy sector, and when we're talking about monitoring and evaluation. A lot of what we've just talked about and a lot of what Annick was saying is not considered as important or relevant. Because measurement is immediately conflated with quantitative approaches, numbers, and there is this kind of demand for experimental approaches. So the more qualitative, more interpretivist approach to measurement is not at all valued, and I think should be much more valued within the monitoring and evaluation sector, at least in our field.
Yeah, I can follow right up on that, because I think that also speaks to maybe the last question a little bit and from the Zoom, you know, the sort of question of interpreting the meanings of words and those kind of things that, you know, I would say immediately, right? Cross-culturally, that's super, super complicated. Language intervenes immediately, and it's not just the meaning of a word, but it's the meaning of, you know, sort of the word doesn't exist sort of independently from its context. Anybody who speaks more than one language knows that you cannot express the same things in the same way, et cetera, et cetera. So then if you're just looking for words, or, you know, then, so obviously, and I'm not saying that people are actually just looking for words, though sometimes, Tim, you were saying you were just looking for words earlier. But you know, the sort of the meaning, of course, is extremely contextual. And I think that, you know, this sort of deeper interpretive work, the really contextual, the sort of long-term working within one context, right? And I think this is sort of, you know, the sort of against maybe the big data stuff, which, you know, I see there's a value in it too, right? But I'm always left with the, okay, so what, or why, or, you know, how did we get here and where are we going? Like the sort of more long-term, you know, deeper type of analysis that will actually, you know, help us, you know, really get at the impact, right? And you have to sort of be in the context, I think, for a longer period of time. Maybe I should have been an anthropologist, but anyway, I'm not. But sort of that I think provides, you know, a different kind of measure of these things that, you know, and I understand, you know, why we don't have that as much. It doesn't fit into a table. It, you know, sort of doesn't make for nice, colorful graphs or whatever. But yeah, I will add to your plea and pass it on.
All right, thank you. Thank you for these fascinating questions. Now, I just would like to briefly chime on the outcome versus impact thing. So when I try to find data on to what extent a given provision in the Peace Accord is implemented, right? So I call that, you know, I'm trying to know the intervention. Actually, intervention is taking place or not. The outcome is, you know, if the intervention is taking place in the right time, the right, you know, place, then maybe down the road I would be able to find the outcome of that intervention, right? So you can easily relate that to, for example, Peace Accords can come, you know, with a provision for education sector reform. Now I'm really interested whether that happened or not, right? You know, without seeing those things being implemented, I cannot expect literacy rate to go up, right? So it's still a value of trying to understand that dynamics there. Tim, I really love your question. In that particular graph that you saw on the networks of various actors, we were trying to understand, you know, that was specific to Afghan negotiation process. What I did in that particular project was collected all the information that we can find from various sources. Who is talking with whom at 2-degree level, meaning like, you know, on specific issues related to Afghan peace process. So we collect tons of data, you know, between the government panels and the Taliban panel negotiating with each other outside the negotiating table, and also with international community. There was a lot of, you know, interaction at the dyadic level, also at the group level. And the proxy question is, you know, whether they are reliable or not. You know, I mean, that was the point that I wanted to make. You know, whether all these networks are really reliable or not. You know, in terms of, you know, getting the issues right for that particular peace process. You can think of, like, you know, in Afghan negotiation process, you know, women's issue was at the front and center, you know, from the very beginning. And the only actors who were talking that particular issue is the international actors, but they were talking among themselves. They were not talking that issue with the Taliban. You know, when they had the opportunity to talk about that issue, or when they had the meeting with Taliban, They were not talking about that particular issue. And women's group were, talking with all these international actors, but they were not asking, international actors to accompany them when they have a meeting with the Taliban. So you can see, obviously, these, intermediaries, they have to justify why they exist, but they are, sometimes can be really lousy. They would not be able to take, on the issues, head on. So that's the thing, that I found from that particular analysis. But obviously there were proxies, who helped the peace process get through. Like, for example, we can think of the peace accord in Macedonia. Even the Taif Accord was done through proxies. We really don't know who are the actors. Or even the Northern Ireland Peace Accord, we really don't know. I mean, the combatants were not on the table, right? It was done through the proxies. It works, but maybe these days, maybe it has a little bit of change there. So I'll pass it to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for great questions. I think we could stay here all night, but we're not going to, because they bring up so much things. And it's also fun because all of a sudden I find myself in the shoes of a big data person. That's the first time in my life. So that's really interesting. So Tim, thanks for the question about peace messaging. It's not something we've looked at yet, but I think it's a really interesting thing, because I think it's something that I think it would be really hard to trace causality, but I think you can see a before and after. And I think, that's relevant in the Colombian case, but look at the many conflicts where you have bots just, pumping out messages in a certain direction. So I think it's interesting to try to see what that actually does with the general discourses or narratives or the way people feel about certain things online or talk about it online. So that's a very good suggestion. And RCTs, in fact, a postdoc in my project, Gustav, has just done a survey experiment in the Meta region in Colombia, and Angelica and I and him are working on a paper on that, where we looked at people who were exposed to apologies from former FARC members, and then how they reacted to the apologies, and also when people endorsed the apologies, such as the Pope or a victim or someone else. So I think it brings really interesting answers, but as Pamina warned, there's obviously quite high internal validity in those. But then when it comes to context and a lot of other things, you kind of miss out. So I think there are pros and cons, but I think it's an interesting way of getting certain answers. And then in terms of outcomes, the question that came from Zoom, I think, in certain areas in the DDR field, for example, I think there has been quite a lot of, both looking at implementation, but also what happened to the people who went through these processes of security sector reform. There has been research, and I think that's, again, very important, because we can look at implementation all we want, but if we don't look at the next step, then we don't know what actually happens. But again, the question of causality is always difficult. Just because a person didn't get a job after a DDR process, do we know that it's because the DDR process was horrible, or was it some other contextual factors? But again, I think it's an important thing. And then in terms of words and knowledge building, especially in social media research, I don't buy that argumentation fully, but sometimes actually in social media research, then you actually escape the question of the researcher telling people what to think by implying certain things in their questions, but the data come from the bottom up or from the material. And then again, we're back at interpretation. So we're back at words, but then it's at least getting the words from the source, so to speak. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Can I quickly say something about Tim's question about peace messaging in Colombia, because that was the paper I published in 2017. So what I did, with a PhD student and computer science professor was create a domain knowledge on what's going on in terms of the peace process, and use algorithms to get all the data, Twitter data coming from Colombia for a specific period of time. So we started that, once the FARC signed the ceasefire in August 2016, and we followed, on a daily basis. We collected millions of tweets coming from Colombia up to the day of the referendum. we were looking at the data, we were very clear that the no is going to win for two reasons. The patterns that we noticed in the data, was that they were much more frequent in their messaging. The Botano no was the most frequently trending tweet coming from Colombia. And also at the same time, they were shared so much frequently compared to vote for peace, right? The PAS or equal Trump that they were using. Very, the density of the tweet coming on specific Trumps were very different, and also in terms of the polarization that created, right? So the negative messaging were getting a lot of attention, a lot of retweet with comments compared to the positive messaging. And also one thing that we noticed was sometimes the peace can be trickle down effect. Like the political leaders, they are in the front and center of the messaging, space, right? So Uribe was tweeting quite a lot compared to Santos, and whatever Santos was tweeting was not retweeted that much compared to Uribe's. So you see, how that plays out, and we were telling it's going to be no, because a lot of people were talking about against the peace accord, but there was exactly that outcome. So,
thank you. So we have time for one more question from the room, if someone has one. David, wait for the microphone.
Well, it's just a little follow-up on this question about messaging and narratives. Really nice to hear people talking about narratives as part of understanding peace. But I just wanted to push a little bit and clarify who is the author of these narratives? What is the author self when we talk about social messaging, for example? Is this genuinely a bottom-up, spontaneous discourse that we can trust as a reflection of popular opinion? Or is it really a reflection of discourses promoted by elite actors, by manipulation, by state media, series of interventions on social media that we all know about? And the same with narratives. Are these genuinely reflections of oneself, or is it part of a bigger discourse that you have to take into account? If so, how do you do that?
Maybe Lisa wants to start.
Thanks for that question. I think the people at the techno-anthropology lab that I've worked with, they've detected quite good strategies to at least kind of separate big bot messaging, million tweet style from others. But then I'm sure if there are, because I know, for example, in Israel, they have crazy Twitter campaigns for making people, regular people, in a very easy way to retweet certain things. And that will be more difficult to I think, detect. So I think that you're definitely onto something, and that's something that has to be taken into consideration. And what is actually authentic here and what is something else? And I think that is something that we methodologically really have to work with, because otherwise it's just, just sand that we're looking into. So that's a good question. Another question on that to Madhav is that when you did that, you looked at Twitter, and we've also been looking a little bit at Twitter, and Twitter is, many people would say, more of an elite forum. I mean, we all maybe look at Twitter, but a lot of regular people, they don't use Twitter to the same extent, whereas Facebook is a broader, not for everyone, but for more people. So even if you say that there were so many tweets on Twitter, would it have made more sense to look at Facebook to get a broader, to know how it reached out to broader segments, maybe?
I mean, that project is now done, so.
In a broader sense, if you want to do something similar.
What we did was we were actually looking where the tweets are coming from, whether it is inside Bogota or outside Bogota. So we were able to, of course, those who are very frequent in tweet are probably not very much frequent on Facebook or even WhatsApp, right? So obviously there will be a lot of variation, but in terms of we have to think still in the transitional political transition context and transition from war to peace or from authoritarian to democracy. the elites are in the front and center of that process, right? And they are the drivers, of all the messaging. So it makes sense to look at those elites, those actors, and how. I mean, if they are maybe. So. I mean, I don't know why I always think about Trump here, but you see, the point, why he needed to be banned, from Twitter, right? I mean, it's or subsequently, from other social media. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense. There was a colleague, in Myanmar that I interacted with when I was specifically looking at that case for a while, for some time in the past. So his strategy was not the Twitter, but the Facebook. So maybe there are countries where people are more, attuned to one type of, technological platform versus the others. What he was doing was, going through. He did that manually for some time. I don't know whether he automatized that or not. So he went to the Facebook page of all the military leaders, and trying to understand, to what extent those military leaders are related to broader society. In terms of their spouses, in terms of their kids, who goes to where. But he was selling that information to the corporations, because then he would be able to find out that network where to influence, right? So it's a, obviously the point was like, some technology is much more useful in one space versus the other, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Annick or Pamina, would you like to respond
Yeah,
to David's
sure.
question?
I mean, I think the question of like the different social media platforms is super interesting as well, because it's age as well, right? And all of this kind of stuff, different parts of the world. But to the question of the sort of author or authority of narratives, you're sort of touching a little bit on the question of like, can we get closer to the truth with the narratives? Ish is my answer, as in, by sort of, looking at the variety of sort of more localized contextual narratives, so to speak. And those could be interviews, they could be media narratives. So there's different things you could analyze. There could also be that, we are all constructing narratives every time we write up these things, right? And so then the question of voice and, are you speaking for, are you bringing somebody's, are you bringing sort of that voice out? And then you have the issue of like, okay, if you're going back to the same place, you're talking to the same person, or even like just in the room, right? If you tell a sort of an account of an event, it might change slightly depending on the day, or all of these kind of things. So I'm kind of less interested in this question of, is it getting us closer to the truth, and more interested in the question of what are the effects of telling particular kind of stories, of lifting particular kinds of stories to be the story, of how other kinds of maybe more marginal or unacknowledged, et cetera, stories can actually help us challenge what we consider to be normal. So in my book on this topic, I looked at 9/11 and sort of like, so who's 9/11, right? And how does it look different depending on where you look? And so I think there are different ways of playing with narrative approaches to get at different things. But I think that the question of the effects of, sort of the massively circulated stories versus, the ways in which, and this is really very much a post-structural thing in terms of looking for the fissures, looking for, the way in which also the story sort of has its own deconstruction built into it. So those are the things I'm interested in, because I think those effects are really sort of where politics kind of happens, right? So.
This resonates very much with everyday peace indicators and with our experience. I think oftentimes our indicators are many narratives, narratives of communities, of issues, and oftentimes I think there's a concern that I don't think we've quite resolved about how those narratives, how those narratives are representative of moments. So we talked earlier about this question of, you know, how do the indicators change over time, especially if there's major issues that maybe happen in that country or in that context. But also, I mean, if you think about like, you know, the concept of peace, and if we're talking about peace and peace indicators, and how do we know that what community members are telling us is actually a narrative about peace, or if it's just a narrative of the issues that are arising in that community. And that's something that we do try to confirm within our discussions by asking, you know, especially when there's an issue that maybe comes up that seems strange, we, you know, come back with a question of, okay, well, how is that an indicator of peace? But it's still a question. I mean, and a question where, you know, that is oftentimes just relevant to the current context. So like if you think about like, you know, times of drought, then there might be a bunch of indicators that have to do with water, but that might not be the case at another time. So it's narratives of moments, right? But when we are trying to measure and, you know, use that standard over time, it becomes more complicated to use that narrative as an indicator or a standard across time.
Thank you. So we are out of time. It's been a really lively roundtable, which I'm sure has raised questions that we will all be thinking about in the time to come. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your experiences and your insights, and to all the participants for joining our roundtable. Thank you very much.